My introduction to radio came when I was in high school in a play, and one of the other students had a program on the local radio station in which she did stuff about high school. So we did a portion of the play to promote attendance. And it was a normal kind of into the studio and stand around and do what you're told. So we did our scene, and I examined the pianos and the microphones and all the things I should have kept my fingers away from. And a very senior broadcaster spoke to me as I went out of the studio, and I thought I was in deep trouble. But of course he said, if you have an interest in radio, would you like to come in and try some reading? Would you like to audition? Well, audition was a great big buzzword, and I accepted eagerly and came in and did my audition, whatever that was, and ended up with a program. In those days, the radio stations were provided with scripts already written to go with the music that had been shipped by the record companies. So I was given a program with a selection of music already chosen, and I did that for a long time. And eventually, when I got out of high school, because my father had said, before you join the Army, you must have 1 year of work experience. And that was, I think, predicated on the fact that when he came back from his war, which is the Boer War, excuse me, there was no veteran support. There was a handshake, and people said, well, Will, you're back. Oh no, we've filled your job. However, you won't have any trouble getting one. Well, you goodbye. Excuse me. And that soured him, and I think rightly, because we now have such wonderful support. But he wanted to guard me from that situation. And I appreciated it because I worked at the radio station until I decided to join the Army. I was paid, after a real while, I was paid $10 a week. Well, of course, I enjoyed working there, but I then went into the Army and turned my back on it for the time I soldiered. Came back out, having left my regiment, which I think this was cardinal in my broadcasting career. I left my regiment when the hostilities ended. And I went then to the Army of Occupation for several months, where I was the radio officer for Northwest Europe in the 2nd Canadian Public Relations Group. They were the group which provided all the film from the war. They had a photographic unit, and they had a film unit, and they had a support unit for all the correspondents who came to Europe, who wanted to see what was going on in the Canadian sector. And I went into that part. I was a conducting officer for a while. That meant that when Walter Cronkite came and wanted to interview someone in the German city of Wilhelmshaven, I was elected to take him up there and break the ice, excuse me, with the locals, to find the man to talk to. And I was called the conducting officer, and that's what we did. Matthew Halton as well was a frequent visitor. And these were people who came to where we lived, which is called a press camp. And I became a radio officer, and my responsibilities included distributing broadcast material that was sent to us from London. And we had radio stations in Hilversum, Hamburg, Berlin. And I would deliver this material to these chaps. Anyway, that's background to what a broadcast officer did, I guess. And I was fortunate enough to go to Nuremberg and see and hear the war crimes trial, to Aurich for the trial of Canada's first war crimes trial, tried General, now his name is rolled right off the end of my memory, Kurt Meyer. And I attended the Kurt Meyer trial, and had a lot of very enjoyable broadcast experiences in those days, and got a lot of experience, so that when I came back to St. John, I was able to go back into broadcasting and went to the radio station and said, oh boy, here I am, a captain in the Army by this time, married by this time, matured a little bit by this time, I'm all ready to go to work. Well, we're glad to have you back, and we can increase your salary. We'll increase it to $25 a week. I didn't take the job. Then a couple of other men in St. John created a radio station called CFBC, and I went to work for them. And the manager, Norm Botterill, said, how much money do you make as a captain in the Army? And I then knew, and I don't now. And he said, that's comfortable, that's what you'll get. And that's what I got as a salary. And I worked there for, I guess, 10 years. Good broadcasting. That was the halcyon age of broadcast radio. I remember particularly doing interviews with Arthur Fiedler. I've never forgotten that interview. He was the director of the then famous Boston Pops Orchestra. We sat down at the microphone, him and me, and we then recorded, and this will be hard to remember, we recorded onto a flat wax disc. Now think about that. There was no cutting, no editing, no retakes. When the needle started to move on that wax, it went to the end. If you made a boo-boo, the boo-boo stayed or you stopped broadcasting. We broadcast our interview, we recorded our interview rather. It took 22 minutes. It was a beautiful interview. I've never forgotten it. But those were the days when airplanes didn't have great fuel capacity, and you may wonder what that has to do with radio. But they had a custom of landing in St. John to refuel. So one day I got a call, would I come out to the airport, would I like to interview a man whose name is John F. Kennedy? And I said yes, and took my tape recorder and went. And there, on the coffee shop stool, was John F. Kennedy, then a member of the Senate, I think, in the United States administration. And we had a great interview because I said to him, Mr. Kennedy, last night the Russians launched a vehicle into space called Sputnik. Now, will that in any way influence the American space program? And he said, no, of course not, no. Well, either he was wrong or I was wrong, but I rather think it did. Anyway, that was my interview with John F. Kennedy. There were several others that were quite colorful and achieved the same way because airplanes stopped and people got off, and he got off because Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, was then the Chancellor of the University of New Brunswick, had invited him to speak and give the Onsignia address at UNB. And John Kennedy was going to do the address. The broadcasts out of St. John were good. We had a wonderful broadcaster, Bob Bowman, who was tremendous. He had a fierce, wonderful ego which drove him and us. And I remember particularly, he gave me the final flattery. He said to me one time, he was very upset, and he shook his finger in my face and said, you would do a thing like that? You, Canada's second greatest broadcaster? Well, I told that to a doctor in London, Ontario, and he looked at me and said, who would ever say a thing like that? Who would ever tell you you were the second greatest broadcaster? And I said quite humbly, the man who knew himself to be number one greatest broadcaster. And he probably was. He had ingenuity, he had ability, and he had chutzpah. And those three things together can make a broadcast pretty good. I ended my career in St. John as a broadcaster to go into the public relations business, and went on then to Toronto, where I was in the public relations business for a long time. Other than that, my broadcast interests have included things that I've done with the CBC as items since. And one artifact I dug out the other day, I found in the bottom of a drawer somewhere, was a pay slip from the British Broadcasting Corporation. It indicated that they had paid me £3 sterling. Now I've been puzzling what I could have done for the BBC that earned £3. When you think about it, in those days, £3 sterling would have been about $15. And I can't think what broadcast could have earned that much with such a giant broadcast corporation.